This is a presentation of Chapter 2 in CCNA1, and it is about configuring a networking operating system. This is part 1 of Chapter 2. So let's have a look at it. It is in all kinds of network devices, we have a kind of an operating system. It is a much simpler and not a complex operating system like the one you're used to on your computers. It's much more simple, and it's typically only text-based. The one that we are going to work with is based only on text commands. It's not a graphical user interface. Some of the home networking devices will be delivered with a web interface as well, so that you can configure it by just clicking. Many of your home networking devices you will also see that the operating system itself, it is called a firmware. We are going to work with Cisco devices like we have here in the lab, and they all have a Cisco network operating system called the iOS. You probably know the word iOS already, which is also used by another IT vendor, which is Apple. Cisco actually started using the abbreviation iOS much earlier than Apple, but I think nowadays if you mention iOS we automatically think about Apple. But this is also a Cisco operating system, and it is short for Internet Working Operating System. Internetworking operating system. So all these different devices here have the same operating system, and the main function of the operating system is, of course, for us as humans and for applications to be able to work with the hardware. For those of you who have ever tried communicating directly with hardware will know that it is not very user-friendly. And of course, we don't want all different applications running on our computer to have directly access to the hardware and taking all the CPU or using up all the memory or whatever. So we need a controlled interface to work with the hardware, and that is the purpose of the operating system. We have typically the kernel who takes care of all different kinds of functions that we need to operate directly on the hardware, and then we have the shell, which is more or less the user interface where we as humans can interact with the hardware or the applications that are running on your computer. So when we are going to configure and operate these kind of networking devices, the shell is just a command line interface, CLI. It's only for entering different commands. Those of you who have tried operating with older types of operating system will know that earlier on we had to just enter commands to make things work. We couldn't just click on anything because there were not anything to click on. So we are going to just enter a lot of commands in these networking devices. Yeah, this is just to tell you that a PC operating system is entirely different. You can do so much more on a computer than you can do in these very, very simple operating systems in the networking devices. Yeah, so when we look at these devices, they don't have a hard drive like you have on your computer. So you cannot just, save your operating system on the hard drive. In these cases here, they have flash memory. And in these flash memories, we have installed the operating system. The difference between normal random access memory and flash is that the flash will be kept even if you power off the device, which is a very smart thing when you want to keep your operating system in here. It's called non-volatile storage, which means that it will still be there when you power off. There will, of course, be a running copy of the operating system which is in RAM, but that will, disappear or be deleted when you power off the device. The functions that we can configure and look at with our operating system in these devices are, for instance, the different types of routing tables. This is a switch We also have routers and how to operate them and how to route traffic from one network to another will be configured within the devices. If this were a layer 3 switch, we will also do it in here. It could be quality of service, it could be different interfaces, how they should be working. Is it a normal switch port? Is it a VLAN? Whatever. All these different things that we can, configure the device with. We need to use the operating system for that. The different MAC addresses are in there, but we want to configure, for instance, IP version 6 addresses, and the security settings as well. And it could be something about the different management. Do we want to monitor what's happening in the devices? So it's more to configure it and to set it up from the beginning. We need an interface to do so, and that is why we are using the iOS. We also need somehow to be able to connect to these devices, because if you buy a switch like this, well then of course you can just power it on and then it will basically work. But if you want to configure it, set up a VLAN or anything, you need to get access to it. And when there is nothing configured, you don't have a networking address on these devices, so you need to connect to it by using a very specific cable, which is called a console cable. It's these blue things here we have up in the lab. So we connect this to the console port on the switch and the other end to my computer, and then I can get access to it in that way. If it's pre-configured with some kind of an IP address, I can connect through the network with using a protocol called Telnet or a protocol called SSH. Or the last way of connecting it is through the AUX port, which is where you can actually put in a modem. It's a very old thing. We don't really use it anymore, but that was the idea of using the AUX. Connect the modem and connect through it through the modem port. So what we do when we want to have access to it is that we connect to the access port, to the console port, and we put in the console cable, and then we can start configuring it. To be able to configure it, we can also use Telnet or SSH. Telnet is a very, very simple protocol where you just through the network, if you have the IP address of the device, you can Telnet into it, and then you also get access to the command line interface, CLI. If you want to be more secure, you can use SSH instead, but that needs to be configured before you can enter it. So if you buy a new device which is completely empty, you have to use the console port to get access to it. Otherwise, it's not possible. Or you can use the AUX for the phone lines with the modems. Of course, when you connect to the console port over here, you need to have the other end put into your computer. In the lab here we use the serial interfaces, so we have another type of cable end here. In your laptops you probably don't have a serial interfaces, so then you buy some kind of a USB adapter that can take care of the conversion between serial and USB. Then of course we need some kind of a program to be able to connect to it. And we are using in the lab here a terminal emulation program called PuTTY. You could also use the built-in program in Windows, which is Hyperterminal. I think also OXS has a terminal configuration program. PuTTY is the easiest way to connect to it. So we just connect and we say we're going to connect through the serial interface, and then we just get access to it that way. When we meet the operating system, it is, as I said, only text. And there are text in different modes. So when we connect for the first time, we are in something called user mode. In user mode, you're not allowed to do anything. You can just use a very, very limited amount of commands. And then you can change into other modes if you need to change something. For instance, you can go into the next mode, which is a privileged mode. Here you can see, for instance, the configuration and how it's set up. And then you can go into configuration mode where you can change the configuration, and then into the interface configuration modes and so on. It's built up in a hierarchy. You start in the top where you actually are not able to do anything, and then you go through the different levels, and in the end you are able to change something down on an interface, for instance. You can see it on the prompt that the switch or the router will give you. If it's a larger than after the name, then you are in user mode and you're not allowed to do anything. If you are in privileged mode, you will see a hashtag after the name of the switch or the router. And then you can do something. Then when you are, for instance, in the privileged mode, then you can say configure terminal and press enter, and then you will be in config mode. Then you can see the prompt also changes to router config. Then you are in configuration mode, and config IF if you are on the interface configuration mode. So you will always be able to see on the prompt on the screen which mode you are in. And many of the commands are only available if you are in the correct mode. So you need to know in which mode you are in. You will get used to that. To be able to switch between them, to go back to the mode before, well, then you just use the exit command. You could also use a disable, but use exit. That's much better. So if you want to go back, just exit. You can also use the command end. Exit or end will get you back. When you're going to enter the commands, you can just put in the command itself. In this case here, it's ping, to send a ping request. And then you enter the keyword, which is the IP address you want to ping. You can also get help. If you just say ping, then it will ask you about the IP address. Sometimes it just says incomplete command. That means you need to add something more. There is a small kind of help system within the operating system, so you will know if you have put in something wrong. It is, for instance, you can enter a question mark. If you know that there is a command starting with CL, you can say CL and question mark, and then it will suggest to you, do you mean clear or clock? If you need to set the clock on the device, well, then you say clock and a question mark, and then it will tell you the next keyword here is set, so clock set. And then after that, you need to put in the day and the month and so on. If you just keep entering a question mark, then the system itself will help you and tell you what you need to add next. If you just say clock set and nothing else, it will say incomplete command, and it will, help you to tell you what to put in. If there is an invalid input, then it will show by a small arrow, this is what I don't understand. So you will always be able to get help, a little bit help anyway, from the operating system. There are also hotkeys and shortcuts. If you use a tab, then it will, try to find the correct command. If you start saying CLO and press tab, then it will suggest to you that you mean clock, for instance. So you can also always use that to finish the whole command. You can use Control R to redisplay, Control A to move to the beginning, Control Z will also do the same as exit. You can use arrow down and arrow up to get the previous command. Control Shift 6 will interrupt the process that it's going on in the operating system. Sometimes you can start something you don't really want to finish, and then you can use Control Shift 6. And you can use Control C to exit the current configuration and abort the current command. Yeah. when we are using these different commands, we have the whole setup of the whole hardware setup of the Cisco devices. We have the RAM, the memory, where we have all the running programs in. So for instance, if you say show version, it will look at the running operating system and display the version of that. It can be show ARP, show MAC address table, will show you how exactly the MAC address table is built up at the moment in RAM. You can also use a command called show flash, which will tell you the content of the flash memory. You can use something called show startup config, and it will look into the NVRAM because it has another kind of non-volatile memory, which is called the NVRAM. This is where the router or the switch will save the configuration file. Because, of course, when we have made a lot of changes to the configuration, we would like to save it so that we don't have to do it again if we power it off. And the startup configuration file is saved within the NVRAM. So if you do a show or show startup config, it will show you the startup configuration file. Show running config will show you the running configuration file, the one that you are, for instance, editing at the moment. So a lot of show commands will show you the content of these different memories. Show version command will just show you what kind of an operating system that you are running. It is like the Cisco way of thinking with operating system is that you have a minimum if you want, and that is your operating system, the default operating system. If you want to add more functionality, you will add a more advanced version of it. So we add functionality if you need it. It's kind of opposite to, for instance, Windows, where you have all different kinds of functionality and you have a huge operating system, whether you just want to use a small part of it. So here you will need to add new things if you, for instance, want it to work with a specific kind of fiber optical cables or whatever. So you might need to update your operating system. Yeah, that was the first part of this chapter.